The fur trade era is at the heart of Canadian history. It's where the foundations of our culture and identity were built. It's a time filled with stories from every corner of our land, connecting Indigenous nations, Francophones, Anglophones, and the Métis in ways that shape who we are today. Some of these stories are inspiring, reflecting the toughness of the first people who came here, like the Voyageurs, the Courreurs des Bois. We have stories of generosity, of welcoming from Indigenous people who helped share their knowledge of the land. But we also have stories that are sad and brutal to read about and that reflect the overall struggle around cultural survival in Canada. But most importantly, like all of history, it gives us lessons that we can apply on a lot of issues that we're having today. The only problem in Canada is that we, Canadians, we don't know anything about our history. We aren't able to tell stories of incredible people like Sur, a Dene woman from Manitoba who, during the fur trade, brought peace between her nation and the Cree. We don't tell stories of the Voyageurs or the Courreurs des Bois who trekked and canoed thousands upon thousands of kilometers across our whole land, or the rise of the Métis nation, who became a fusion of European and Indigenous cultures who not only played a huge role in the fur trade, but became a founding people of the Canada we have today. So in this video, I want to tell the stories of the people who dominated this era of our history. If as a country we want to understand or form a Canadian identity, we can't do that without knowing our history. We became a country in 1867, but the cultural and the social fabric of what is Canada started being established much before that. So, without further ado, let's dive into the epic, hilarious, and yet brutal lives of the fur traders. Let's go! Fur trading in itself started way back as soon as the French started arriving in what is Nova Scotia, Quebec, Newfoundland. They traded with the Mi'kmaq, the Innu, but then they started establishing permanent settlements like Quebec, Tadoussac, Trois-Rivières, later on Montreal. And it's only once permanent settlements started being established that you saw the emergence of the Courreurs des Bois. The Courreurs des Bois, the bushrunners they call in English, they were entrepreneurs who roamed the forests in and around the Great Lakes region. Les Courreurs des Bois, they desired freedom more than anything else. And freedom is a theme that comes up a lot in Canadian history. And it's no different in the early parts of Canada. Les Courreurs des Bois, all of them preferred by far living among Indigenous people, the land, rather than being stuck in a settlement where not only were they not doing much, but most people didn't know how to actually adapt and survive in this very harsh environment, especially the winters where there wasn't really much to do apart from farming. Most of them were poor back in France. They were poor farmers. They were peasants. They lived in poverty, and they weren't gonna replicate that when they came here. So when they encountered Indigenous nations, it offered them freedom no one or nothing else could. Many Courreurs des Bois completely integrated among Indigenous nations. They learned their languages, their customs. They adapted to their way of life. Some of them lived with Indigenous nations their whole life, like Etienne Brûlé, who lived among the Huron pretty much his whole life. He arrived in New France when he was like 9 years old and never left. He never went back to France. He became Indigenous in many ways. He's considered the first great explorer of the Great Lakes, the first Franco-Ontarian. But overall, when you look at a map of all of these French explorers, you cannot forget that none of it could have been done without the Indigenous nations who welcomed them and who guided them throughout this new land, whether they were the Ojibwe, the Innu, the Huron. Now I want to focus on one man in particular called Pierre Esprit Radisson. Pierre Esprit Radisson, he arrived in New France in the 1650s when he was about 16 years old. And not long after that, he became a Courreurs des Bois and got captured one day when he was hunting in and around Trois-Rivières. He got captured by the Haudenosaunee, who were these sworn enemies of the French during that time. But he would later on escape, found his way back to Trois-Rivières, but he would keep on being a Courreurs des Bois, exploring new parts of New France, meeting with the Huron, building relationships with the Ojibwe, learning their languages. He was a multicultural person. He knew how to speak English, he knew how to speak French, different indigenous languages, but he wanted to explore even more. He wanted to go deeper into this land he was discovering. So Pierre Esprit Radisson, along with his half-brother, Médard Chouard des Groseilliers, very French names, Médard Chouard des Groseilliers, they ventured into what is James Bay today. They met with the Cree, established good relationships, and started trading fur. The only problem is that when they brought him back to New France, the nobility of the ruling class of New France, they weren't happy with Pierre Esprit Radisson and Médard des Groseilliers because they wanted to keep the price of fur artificially high. Pierre Esprit Radisson, he became disillusioned with New France, the nobility, all of that. He wanted to make some money. He wanted to be free. He wanted to explore. He wanted to be his own man, a free man. And this pushed him to go to England and proposition to the crown to fund an expedition for him and Médard des Groseilliers all the way back into the Hudson's Bay, where he had established good relationships with the Cree and where they could get better quality furs. And it's during that time that the Hudson's Bay Company got founded. In 1670, it was because of Pierre Esprit Radisson's proposal to the English crown that the HBC Company got funded. So, funny enough, the HBC, Hudson's Bay Company, very renowned English company, well, the idea of it came from a couple of Frenchmen who weren't happy with the French nobility and wanted to make some money. But overall, Pierre Esprit Radisson, over the course of his life, he would alternate between the French, the English. He lived an incredible life. I have a whole video about him. Go and check it out. Super interesting. Now I want to focus a bit more on the Hudson's Bay Company and what were their business model and how they interacted with Indigenous people and the stories that we can derive from that. The Hudson's Bay Company, they established a royal charter, as they called it, over a vast span of territory across what is Canada today, Manitoba, parts of Alberta, northern Quebec, Ontario, called Rupert's Land. But to Indigenous people, this wasn't Rupert's Land. It was their land. Hudson's Bay Company workers started establishing themselves along the coast in northern Ontario, northern Manitoba, northern Quebec. Some of these workers for the Hudson's Bay Company, they stuck around. Some of them went back. But what is for sure is that the chief factors, the men who owned each fort across their respective coasts, they formed strong relationships with Indigenous nations like the Cree and the Dene. You have stories of people like Tanad Sur. Tanad Sur, she was an Indigenous woman, a Dene woman. At the time, their Dene nation had conflicts with the Cree. And Tanad Sur, when she was a young woman, a young girl, she got captured by the Cree. She managed to escape, found her way to an HBC trading post, and then she set off on a journey to bring peace between the Cree and the Dene, her nation. Because of her, the fur trade, the Hudson's Bay Company was able to expand the fur trade more towards the northern parts of Canada, the Northwest Territories, northern Manitoba, and this allowed the Dene to acquire tools which made their lives better. Ultimately, helped them hunt, helped them survive. It gave them new tools that made their lives easier in a very harsh environment. You also have stories of a man like Matonabbee, who as a young boy was adopted by an Englishman. He knew how to speak Cree, Dene, he knew how to speak English, and he became a sort of cultural intermediary between Indigenous nations and the Englishmen who lived in the forts. Matonabbee, he guided a man called Samuel Hearne in one of the most amazing adventures in Canadian history, all the way to the Coppermine River in what is Nunavut today. Imagine Tanad Sur, Matonabbee trekking, all Indigenous nations really trekking all of these lands, trading fur in this incredibly harsh environment. For me, it's simply amazing and cool to read about these stories because I can't even imagine how it was like to live in such a harsh environment and a completely different time in terms of culture and society. But man, only just thinking about the land itself, it's incredible to read about, in my opinion. All right, now I want to jump in a new era of the fur trade, which emerged after the 7 Years' War. So the 7 Years' War, this is when New France stopped existing. the English took over. And this saw the emergence of a new company which would come to dominate a large part of the fur trade. They were called the Northwest Company. The Northwest Company, they used existing fur trading routes and relationships that had been established for hundreds of years before by the Courreurs de Bois to establish forts inland rather than being simply on the coast like the Hudson's Bay. Because for the Hudson's Bay, they established forts on the coast and simply waited for indigenous people to come by every year to trade. This was a true business, and the whole supply chain of the fur trade would become supported by a whole bunch of different people. European goods would be packed in Montreal, brought to meeting points across the land, and traded for furs, which would then be sold back in Europe, and every year the cycle went on and on and on. Now, who would bring all of these goods all throughout the land, these different trading posts? They were called les voyageurs, the voyageurs in English, but I'm going to call them les voyageurs because that's how I'm used to saying it. Les voyageurs, the voyageurs. I just can't bring myself to saying the voyageurs. The voyageurs, they were mostly French Canadians. Some of them were Haudenosaunee. Some of them were Ojibwe. They had the most crazy lifestyle that was harsh but amazing at the same time. The voyageurs, all right, I have to put that out there right away. They were absolute beasts, all right? Their days began at 3 or 4 a.m. They would paddle for 16 hours a day and have breaks every 3 hours or so to eat or smoke. They would smoke tobacco. They would cover around 160 kilometers per day in birch bark canoes, which were made by Ojibwe craftsmen. And each canoe had about 5,000 pounds of merchandise. Sometimes they had to portage and carry all of that overland. They had these straps that they would put over their heads along with the canoes. So it wasn't unusual for a lot of them to have broken backs, broken bones in general. It was a brutal life. And when they paddled, they would sing songs to keep morale high and keep the pace going. And then at the end of the day, they would establish their campsites, make a fire, sing a couple of songs, tell stories, and then that cycle would repeat every single day. They would arrive at some forts, like Fort William. Fort William was one of the main rendezvous points for the fur trade, the Northwest Company during that time, and they would get together with a whole bunch of people who had come from across that whole span of land of the company, all across Canada, to meet there, celebrate, and trade. Fort William, which is in Thunder Bay, Ontario today. Shout out to Thunder Bay people if you're watching this video. You got cool history. This area became a meeting point for a whole bunch of people. They sang, danced, drank, and enjoyed a whole lot of rare foods like beef, potatoes, and bread, which typically most people didn't have access to. The voyageurs, like the Courreurs de Bois, they loved freedom. They loved being in nature. They often spent their pay on just having fun. They lived in the moment, you know? One quote in particular, which I think sums up the life of a voyageur and the mentality of a voyageur, is, I have been 24 years a canoe man. No portage was too long for me. 50 songs I could sing. I saved lives, had 12 wives, 6 dogs, and spent all my money on pleasure. Were I young again, I'd live the same way. There's no life so happy as a voyageur life. Many voyageurs lived a double life where they had indigenous wives, indigenous families, not only at Fort William, but spread all over the territories of the Northwest Company, whether they were in Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Northwest Territories. And these were often called country marriages and eventually led to the birth of the Métis Nation. The Métis came from relationships mainly between European and later on French, Canadian, and Scottish fur traders. They were usually indigenous women from nations like the Cree, the Ojibwe, Dene. Métis communities would later grow around fur trading posts like Fort Garry, Pembina, and later on the Red River Settlement, which is where modern Winnipeg is today, and became the cultural and the economic heart of the Métis. By the late 18th century, the Métis, they had developed a unique identity, a unique language called Michif. Michif, I'm not sure how to say it properly, so Michif or Michif, you can correct me in the comments, which blended Cree, French, English. They had their own cuisines, like pemmican, which was dried bison meat, fat, and berries. It was essentially the beef jerky of that time, but super packed with a whole bunch of nutrients. And where would they get their pemmican from? It came from these super organized bison hunts that the Métis became specialized in. They became the primary producers of this essential food for the fur trade, and they supplied both the HBC and the Northwest Company. And that role as a supplier of pemmican gave them economic independence and positioned them as a vital partner in the fur trade. Now, the fur trade, it's not all roses. The way I've talked about it, I talk a lot about the cool parts and what can unite people around the super interesting parts of our history. It's undeniable that the fur trade, over the course of its history in Canada, played a huge role in spreading epidemics. Epidemics like smallpox, measles, tuberculosis spread through fur trading routes, and it devastated indigenous populations who had no immunity. There was at one point in the 1700s, a smallpox epidemic devastated the Dene Nation in northern Manitoba in the Northwest Territories. And Samuel Hearn, the man who made that journey with Matonabbee, who I talked about earlier, he reported that more than 90% of the Dene Nation had perished because of the smallpox epidemic. The fur trade also created intense competition, and it created conflicts between not only the French, the English, the Dutch, but it created conflicts with everyone. The intense competition between the Haudenosaunee and the French is also known as the Beaver Wars, and I have a whole video on that. So it's undeniable that the fur trade incentivized many indigenous nations to expand their own power too, which led to the elimination of other indigenous nations. And finally, a last dark aspect of the fur trade is the environmental degradation that came from it. By the time the fur trade ended, many indigenous nations had become completely dependent on European goods like firearms, metal tools. And when fur trade declined, trading posts became closed. A lot of these communities had no more access to goods that were essential to their survival. And when I talk about the degradation of the land, it's not only about the overhunting of fur-bearing animals like the beaver, who became almost completely extinguished in North America, but it's also about the overhunting and the purposeful complete elimination of the bison, which was done in Canada and in the USA systematically. And it was done to prevent indigenous people and the Métis from getting a vital source of economic activity, a way to sustain themselves, and the purposeful extinguishment of the bison directly led to the starvation of many indigenous nations. The end of the fur trade and the dark aspects that came from it laid the building blocks for a lot of what would happen after Confederation in 1867. So what kind of lessons can we take from all of this, ultimately? There's a lot of cool stories, in my opinion, that we can take from this era of our history. There's stories of adventure, of graciousness, of generosity, of cooperation. But then again, you have stories that are sad and just sad to read about. So all we can do is really learn about it, take pride in the cool parts, and learn from the bad parts. None of us were here when it all happened. And all we can do is unite around the shared history. And I believe if we did more of that in Canada and we shared it and read about it and talked about it in an honest, prideful and a prideful way, I think it would unite many people, because there's a lot of common history in all of it. It's a shared history and it doesn't belong to anyone else. Thank you very much for watching the video. I hope you learned something new and you gained a new appreciation for Canada, Canadian culture, Canadian identity. What is Canada? What is being a Canadian? All right. Thank you very much again for the support, guys. I will see you on the next video. Man, I'm losing my voice. All right. Take care, everyone. Bye.